Poetry saved my life. Using the medicine of metaphor and imagery, pinpointed therapy, I become the doctor, the patient, the wordsmith with a prescription pad, so that poetry can save my life. And I'm here today to talk about how poetry can save the lives of many. And I know what you're thinking. Poetry is something we had to read in a classroom growing up, or you see in a greeting card. But poetry is so much more than that. Poetry has pulled me out of some of the darkest places in my life. Growing up, I had a fairly normal childhood. I had 2 loving parents, a younger and older brother. I was put in a lot of extracurricular activities, mostly sports. I got good grades, and on the surface, I was a pretty happy kid. A lot of people couldn't really see that below all of that, I was hiding some deep insecurities, trauma, anxiety, and this pressure to be perfect. And at 14 years old, when my parents had already gotten divorced and were on their way to marry their new partners, my younger brother and I would move from house to house. We lived a lot of our teenage years out of a suitcase, and I had a lot of feelings that I didn't know how to process around this time in my life. And it would be at this time that I would try to unalive myself for the first time. I took a handful of pills. I wasn't sure what they were or what they would do, and I didn't care. All I knew was I wanted that pain that I was feeling to stop forever. It didn't work, thankfully, but it became an experience that would lead me onto my healing journey, and I would carry all of this baggage that I didn't know how to talk about with anyone. I tried to casually talk about it with my friends, but I was too embarrassed to tell the truth, and I turned to writing. And I used to write these lines, and I would string them together. I was too ashamed to really call the feelings what they were, and that experience was too painful. So I started to just describe it. I had no words for it back then. I didn't know it was called poetry. I thought it was just journaling or something. But I'd string these lines together, and something about it made me feel better. And even though I was writing alone, and I'd read it alone, something about it made me feel less alone. And like I said, I had all these preconceived ideas about poetry being old white men speaking in limerick and sonnets. It wasn't until my high school year, my freshman year of high school, that I would attend an assembly, and I was exposed to spoken word poetry for the first time. It was my first time being able to hear and feel that kind of poetry, something that I could relate to and I didn't have to decipher. A classmate of mine, she got up on stage and she shared a poem that she wrote with the entire school. I couldn't fathom the amount of bravery it took to do something like that. And that inspiring feeling that I felt then is something I still carry with me today. I would later learn more about spoken word poetry in my drama class, about its ties to the Harlem Renaissance and to jazz music and ancient oral history. I learned about metaphor and its ability to dive deeper into a singular feeling, to bring honor to that feeling. For example, I am the doctor, the patient, the wordsmith with a prescription pad. Like a child playing Operation, I use poetry to pinpoint what's hurting and draw it out with my pen like tweezers, only there's no buzzer to fear with this treatment. And I kept learning, and I kept writing, secretly, until one day I was grounded, as I often was at this time in my life, and I wasn't allowed to be home alone. And so my dad made me go with him to one of his music gigs. And I didn't realize that he had noticed I spent all of my free time writing. And because of that, he would introduce me to a woman who would become a mentor of mine. They call her Mama T, and she earned that name. She's loving, she's nurturing, but she's tough. but she's never made me feel like I didn't have a voice. Instead, she taught me how to use that voice. My first interaction with her, she walked right up to me and said, "So I heard you write poetry." I hesitated because I had never called my writings poems before, at least out loud. But I said yes. The next thing she said to me wasn't a question, it wasn't an invitation. She told me that she was going to make room for me to share my poems on stage that day. And that would be the first time that I would be on stage sharing my poetry. I was so nervous. I thought for sure I was going to pass out or throw up. But there's this moment right there when I was standing on stage behind a microphone. I took a deep breath in right before my first line, and I thought, I'm actually doing this. And later that year, at 16 years old, I was invited to accompany the youth poetry slam team to a slam competition in Chicago. I had gone from writing poems alone in my room to being immersed into a world of poetry. I took that trip and I listened to all these poets. I shared a few of my own poems, but I took it all in. I learned the power of words and the stories that we can create, and the emotion that we can evoke, and the connection that all of this brings to each other. I learned about the different styles of poetry, the cadences. I learned about the rhythms, the sad poems, the funny poems, the make you think poems. They're all captivating. It's a sort of wordsmith alchemy, taking something so personal and internal, writing it on a piece of paper, and then transmitting that out into the world. That's powerful. And ultimately, for me, that was healing. Now, that doesn't mean that all poems that are written need to be shared. I have notebooks full of poems that I will probably never share. But just writing it down sometimes is all the healing that needs to happen. Confronting myself and my nagging questions, my deepest insecurities and embarrassing moments, and turning it into something meaningful. And over the years, I continued to write, to learn about myself, to confront my feelings, my worldview, and to honor each stage of my journey. I've written my way into college. I literally was awarded a chance to live on this campus because of a poem that I wrote. And poetry was there when I was suffering from addiction, and it was there when I eventually found recovery. Poetry has been there for me every step of the way. And when I speak and perform, my only hope is that my words can reach somebody in the audience who is feeling alone and unheard, as I felt. It reminds me back to that time in that assembly when I heard my classmate sharing her poem. And in all of her courage, she healed a part of me that day, a part of me that felt like I had nothing to say. And it gave me the audacity to think that I could do that one day. And so in 2017, because of that experience and my desire to help other people feel that same connection, I started an open mic in my hometown with a few of my friends. We still run it today. And I've been able to see so many people from all walks of life and all ages get onto a stage for their first time and share a poem. And the look in their eyes when they're connecting with themselves, the pride and love they feel when they're connecting to an audience, that's powerful. It's a joy to witness. And today, as the Stockton Poet Laureate, I have the honor of sharing my poetry with so many people. But I also get to share the impact that poetry has had on my life. Quite frankly, I wouldn't be here today, on this stage or on this planet, if not for poetry, what it's done for me, and the connection that it's given me. Words and creativity have the power to impact so many of us. So I invite you, the next time your town is hosting an open mic, a poetry competition, or writing workshop, what do you have to lose? We all can experience the healing power of poetry. And instead of driving to work listening to the news that's just going to stress you out, you can put on a playlist of poetry. There's millions of them out there on streaming platforms. And for those of you that are really interested, I invite you to write a poem today. I even have a writing prompt for you. So feel free to grab a piece of paper, grab a pen, and I invite you to write, "Poetry is healing because," you fill in the blank. Thank you.